Hello and welcome back, everyone. And today we are going to be finishing our examination of some of the main themes in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. And today we're going to conclude by examining his thoughts on political economy, bureaucracy, and law, and how these concepts and these realities are related to the rise and the fall of civilizations and the movement of history. Now, if you recall from our first lecture, from our summary introduction, I made mention of his views on political economy and how paradoxically those who live in the cities, while thinking themselves as very free, are in fact subdued and less free than those who live in the rural areas of a civilization or a nation. And I also mentioned at the very end of our lecture examining the geopolitical philosophy and the geography and the geographic dialectic that the emergence of law, of bureaucracy, and all of these rules and regulations are the means by which those who live in the city have a modicum of togetherness, or to at least prevent substantial conflict between parties. And so we need to remember that asabiya is very much at the core of Ibn Khaldun's outlook on life, and those who live in the rural areas still retain and exhibit that asabiya, that group solidarity, that togetherness, in which laws and bureaucratic norms do not have to come in to tell us how to live and how to act, because those who live by the unwritten rules of asabiya have no need for it. But in the city, as asabiya disintegrates over time and through the generations, as the civilization atomizes itself, becomes more individuated, becomes more self-centered and self-seeking, so you have the destruction of asabiya, the rise of bureaucracy and of law and of rules and regulations and conduct in life come about to try to restore those unwritten rules of asabiya, at least as it relates to ethical life and moral living. We cannot have a civilization or a society that is constantly at the throats of each other, constantly suspicious of each other, with no attachment to each other. So the bureaucracy and the law moves in and by force attempts to create a sense of togetherness and compassion, although, as we will see later in this lecture, that's not really a true form of ethics. It's not a true form of morality. Anybody who, for instance, has read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France would see overtures with Ibn Khaldun. Not that Burke read Ibn Khaldun, but they both pin their finger on this very important point, that in the rise of bureaucracy and law, you have pretend benevolence that exercises itself through the implementation of force. It is basically force with a smile, force pretending to be something moral and ethical. But to turn to political economy, Ibn Khaldun, in his famous Ruminations on Political Economy, which is in chapter 3 of the introduction to the Muqaddimah, he discusses how in the beginning of a civilization, in its rise, civilization is extremely productive. Now, productivity in Ibn Khaldun is not a financial productivity. It is not a productivity of capital. It is a productivity of produced goods, mainly in the realm of agrarian produce, but also in the small craft trades, blacksmiths' work and the labor trades, the creation of small trinkets, odds and ends, goods, weapons, etc. Ibn Khaldun does not believe that a society or a civilization is productive simply because they work more hours than they do towards the end of a civilization's lifespan. Although that may very well be true, the real reason for increased and high rates of productivity is because of the consequences or the ramifications of asabiya. People take pride in their work. Their work is filled with that spirit of energy, that spirit of rise that comes with asabiya. So he notes, somewhat interestingly, that at the beginning of a civilization, the tax rate is low, but the yields are very high. So again, the tax rates are not predominantly based on wealth or capital. That may only be relevant in the realm of trade. Really what he's talking about is say the 10% or the 15% yield that goes to the state in produced goods, mostly again agricultural, agrarian, also small tradescrafts. Despite that low tax rate, the general yield due to the high productivity is very high. And so he then notes at the end of a civilization, the economic productivity of a society declines. As a civilization is in decline, its burden becomes more intensified as it is beset by external problems. So civilization, the state, increases its tax rate. It increases its tax proportion. Yet, due to the decline of productivity, despite the very high tax rates that are exhibited by a civilization in its final stages, its actual yield in comparison to its earlier stage is less. So at the decline of a civilization, not only do we have less productivity, we have higher tax rates, and we have less yield with regard to income and with regard to the yield of produced goods. And so we see the stagnation of an economy. And at that point of stagnation, we see two outcomes in Ibn Khaldun's thought. Either there will be that sort of restoration of asabiya, which inculcates into civilization a brief moment of new life in which you would see renewed economic productivity. The tax rates would then again go down. But again, that is only a temporary reality. Eventually, the civilization is going to decline. But that is a possibility. The more likely reality is that in this decline of economic productivity and in increased tax rates, the civilization is in its final stages of life. So that basically summarizes the sociological and the cyclical trend of Ibn Khaldun's look on political economy. But now we want to turn to what is rather the more interesting, or at least what I think is the more interesting and profound examination within the rise and fall of civilizations in Ibn Khaldun. And this is his reflections on the state and of bureaucracy and of law. So if you recall to what we began this lecture with, a civilization in its rise due to asabiya does not live by the burdensome constraints of bureaucracy, law, or the state. Paradoxically, if you're a nonsensical libertarian who really doesn't understand what libertarianism is about, we can actually say that Ibn Khaldun's communitarian beginnings is actually more libertarian than the anti-politics of modern libertarianism. Because although a society in its origins exhibits a strong sense of group feeling, a strong sense of shared values, people do not live by the burdens of the state, of law, and of bureaucracy. Instead, people live on their own account, while people will all end up leading a very similar life in the sense of sacrifice for the community, rule by the chief, a life dedicated to the family. They themselves are living very free lives. They are ruled by the moral law in their hearts rather than the law imposed by bureaucracy, by law, by the state. It is only in the formation of the city that we see the emergence of extensive bureaucracy and law, and that is in part due to the rise of the intricacy of city life, the rise of the complexity of the urban economy, but also because of the decline of asabiya. So as people no longer live by those unwritten rules of life, of nature, and of morality, they begin to live lives of self-seeking pleasure. The city, its fabric, its togetherness, disintegrates. It evaporates. So what a city does, what the metropolitan civilization moves to, is the creation of law and bureaucracy to restrain people's individual lives. They surrender their obligations to each other, to the state, as Ibn Khaldun says. They submit their lives to governors in order to pursue their self-seeking lives of pleasure. So this again is a moment of irony for Ibn Khaldun. We think that by surrendering our lives over to the government to get a return of certain rights and so-called privileges, that we are free. In fact, we are enslaved. We are enslaved to the bureaucracy, to the law, and to the state. At any moment when the bureaucracy, the law, or the state decides to take away whatever rights they may have granted us, the state does in fact have the prerogative to do this. Moreover, for Ibn Khaldun, the consummation of law and of bureaucracy is the metropolitan civilization's attempt to have a sense of asabiya as it is disintegrating in urban life. As urban society, metropolitan society, becomes extensively atomized, that city comes to have conflict within itself. Those who are in the position of political power and of ruleship begin to look down upon those who are, shall we say, the common people living in the city. And the common people living in the city look at the other social groups within society with a certain skepticism and a scorn. In everybody pursuing their own interests, which is what most illiterate libertarians think when they conceive of libertarianism, when everybody pursues their own interests, society actually becomes weak, and it becomes susceptible to the force of the state and of the law. With the destruction of asabiya, with the destruction of the family, with the destruction of those unwritten moral rules which bring people together in a community, this individual, weak, hedonistic person is now susceptible to the force and the power of the state and of bureaucracy. And that is why paradoxically for Ibn Khaldun, city life, despite all of its refinement and its many so-called rights, is in fact enslaved, while those people who live out in the rural zones, those rural regions, and exhibit a high sense of asabiya and of communitarian living, they are actually more free than those who live in the city. And if we think about it, if you live in a country, perhaps the United States, and you've traveled to those rural regions, you can understand what Ibn Khaldun is getting at. In the city is constrained by all of these rules and regulations in how to conduct yourself in life. Yet once you get out into the rural areas, into the small town, you realize the bureaucracy and the laws and regulations that dominate a city life really don't exist in the rural town. Instead, everybody lives by those unwritten codes, those unwritten rules of morality. The bureaucracy is virtually non-existent. You might have the small town mayor, his secretary, and the sheriff, but that's about it. There is no extensive bureaucracy in rural towns as there are in cities. And so what Ibn Khaldun is telling us is that as a civilization, as a people lose their sense of community and togetherness, as they begin to live lives of self-seeking pleasure, what happens is bureaucracy, law, and state emerge to replace asabiya, and the state to try to enforce a sense of togetherness imposes on weak, atomized individuals the laws and the rules and the regulations that are now going to govern our conduct, because we do not have self-restraint and self-responsibility in conduct with other people in our atomized way of life. Thus, the law tells us how we are to act. So thus, in Ibn Khaldun, we can also see the trajectory of law and bureaucracy and the state in relation to the rise and fall of civilization and the movement of history. In the beginning of history, in the beginning of a civilization, in a civilization's rise to acme, there is little law, little bureaucracy, and little state. But this is not the libertarian's paradise of atomized selves. It is actually a communitarian family, a sense of deep bonds of solidarity, a sense of togetherness, which prevents the rise of bureaucracy, law, and the state. And so as history moves forward, and as civilization begins to decline, it is in that decline that we see the rise of the bureaucracy, of the state, of laws, of rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations and laws are the counteraction to the dissipation of asabiya. So a civilization in its decline, in its movement to decline and death, is a civilization that is overburdened by law, by bureaucracy, by regulation. And again, if you consider now everything that Ibn Khaldun is examining in his sociology, in his rise and fall of civilization, he gives us many things today that we ought to consider. That in the terminal decline stage of a civilization, we have an excessively atomized and hedonistic society. That in that terminal decline stage, we see excessive infighting, an internal cannibalization of the nation between those who live in the wealthy urban areas against those who live in the more rural and poor areas. That in the decline of a civilization, there is no more sense of asabiya, of group solidarity, of community. And that in the decline of a civilization, as it is moving towards extirpation, it not only faces external threats from a new civilization that is rising, that is filled with a sense of asabiya, but also that in this stage of terminal decline, we have a civilization that at once is given so many individual rights, but is burdened by an excessive bureaucracy, by an excessive amount of law, by an excessive state that really controls everything in a society. So this has been our introduction to Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. For those who have heard of Ibn Khaldun, I hope these lectures have whetted your appetite, so to speak. I do think that Ibn Khaldun's work is one of the great works of philosophy, of sociology. It is a work that anybody who considers himself an intellectual or is concerned with intellectual matters ought to read. To be an intellectual is not to read The Guardian, The Times, The New York Times, The Washington Post. It is not to be an anti-political person drowning in the world of political activism. It is to step back and to reflect on the great questions of life, the movement of civilization and history, which is exactly what Ibn Khaldun did in the Muqaddimah. He has much to offer us. He has much for us to consider, and we have much to wrestle with in Ibn Khaldun. Thank you.